Okay, in this short video, I'm going to show you how to very quickly integrate an unmanaged device into ACI. In my particular case, I've got a virtual ASA that I want to put between two EPGs and bring it into my ACI fabric. There's a couple of things that I've done ahead of time. The first thing I want to point out is I've actually already instantiated the virtual ASA here, and it's called ASAv routed. I put a very basic config on there. If we go ahead and look at the port groups, the only thing I've really done is put a management IP on and some very, very basic configuration for that is specific to the firewall so that traffic could work. I haven't done anything else. What we're going to see when we do this basic integration is we're going to ask ACI to just handle the network stitching part of it, i.e. put the firewall interfaces where they're supposed to go and make sure that they work through the fabric and do nothing more. So what this means is it won't configure the firewall, it won't do any further automation. This is a good thing in this case because you can allow the firewall administrator to continue to use the device manager or the configuration tools that they've been used to for years. All we care about here is integrating the service in terms of network stitching. So let's actually get started. Over here in ACI, I've already got a tenant built. I've built up a couple of very basic bridge domains, nothing fancy here. And what we're going to do is we are going to take two EPGs. In this case, we are going to take the EPG called Platinum, which represents the inside or secure side of our firewall. And we are going to connect it to another EPG called Migration, which is actually a link for me to get outside of my fabric, which will represent the outside of the firewall. I do have NAT enabled on the firewall and a very basic policy to allow traffic to go through. But those will be our source and destination EPGs. So the very first thing we need to do here is we need to tell ACI about the device that we want to bring into this particular situation. And we do that under the tenant. And there's something called L4 through L7 services. The first thing we need to do is actually create the device and create the template for that device so that ACI knows what it needs to do. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and say create L4 through L7 service graph template. As I said, the first thing we need to do is tell ACI about the device that we want to work with. You can see I've got some other things going on here, please ignore them. But the way we do that is we click on the little plus and we create L4 through L7 devices. The first thing we want to do is untick the managed box because this is an unmanaged service graph. We don't need device packages or anything special. It will just work. We need to give it a name, so we'll say ASA L3 service, whatever you want to call it. We'll tell it that it is a firewall. We do support physical and virtual. In this case, it is virtual. Now, I mentioned earlier, or maybe I didn't mention, that one of the things I already have set up is I've already done VMM integration between ACI and vCenter, and that makes this very easy because what vCenter will do, or what APIC will do, is ask vCenter to list all the virtual machines that you have, which will allow us to find our firewall and go from there. So you can see here I've already created VMM domains here, so I will select the appropriate one. We do support firewall clustering and high availability. In my case, it's the most simple example ever. So it's a single node, single context, nothing fancy. So now that we know what it is, we have to find out where the device is within our infrastructure and the VMware world. So if you select the pull down here, you will see that I have an inventory automatically pulled from vCenter that allows me to tell ACI this is the firewall that I want to integrate. And you can see right there, there's our firewall. The next thing we need to do is tell ACI which interface is the outside, which interface is the inside, etc., etc. So let's go ahead and quickly do that. So let's create the outside interface first. Note in the ASA, in the virtual ASA world, network adapter 1 is always the management interface, so don't get confused. The outside interface, in my case, is actually the first real virtual interface, which happens to map to network adapter 2. So be careful here. So I'm going to say update, that's outside, and then I'll do the same thing for inside. And in my case, I've mapped the inside to network adapter 3. And we'll say update. So we've told ACI about the actual interfaces. Now we need to build what are called the cluster interfaces. As I said, ACI will handle automatically all of the network stitching, put the firewall interfaces in the right EPGs, etc., etc. And in order for it to do that, we need to build these cluster interfaces as part of that process. And it's very easy because it'll look very similar to the step we just did by calling out the device interfaces. So we will call out the names. And again, these names here or here can be anything you want. They do not have to match the name interface of the firewall itself. You can call it green, blue, red, whatever you want. In my case, I'm just calling it outside. So we'll map it to the device outside that we created in the step before. We will do the same thing for the inside, and we'll map it to the interface that we called out before and say finish. Now what we've done here is we've just simply created the device so that ACI is now aware of it, but we're not actually doing anything with it. You can see my device now shows up in the list under the firewall category. What we need to do to complete the graph is click and drag over here and drop it. We need to give the graph a name, so we'll call this ASA L3 Joe. Notice down here we support layer 2 transparent firewalls, which are sometimes called the go through mode, or we support routed firewalls, which is sometimes called go to mode. So what will happen here is we'll have the provider actually use the firewall as its default gateway in routed mode. So that's the go to mode. So we'll go ahead and say submit. So we've completed our service graph template. And as you can see, it shows up in the list. So there's, I forgot the E, but there's a service graph template that we've just created with the device. Now, again, all we've done is create a template. We haven't actually deployed it yet. So that will be the final step. So in order to do that, it's quite easy. Right click on the template we just made and click apply service graph template. So we'll bring up a new window here. The last step we need to do is we need to actually tell ACI which EPG is the outside and should be mapped to that firewall interface, and which EPG is the inside and should be mapped to that particular interface. So if you remember, in my particular case, the inside or trusted segment here was an EPG called Platinum. And in my particular case, I have an EPG called Migration, which has a layer 2 connection outside of my ACI fabric. So that particular EPG is called Migration, and that represents the outside or untrusted segment of the firewall. We deploy service graphs through the form of a contract. So you can choose an existing contract or you can create a new one. I've choose to create a new one, so I'll just make this allow ASA. And what I'm saying here is keep it very simple. The contract doesn't do any filtering, although you can opt to have that extra layer of security if you want. But in my case, I'll just have the firewall do the filtering for me. So I'm just going to keep it simple. So I'll say next. The final step here is we need to sort of tie together the networking constructs within ACI, so which bridge domains, etc., so that then we can do all the automated network stitching. What ACI will try to do is, based on the EPGs that you've called out, it will try to see which bridge domains may already exist. You can always change that. In this particular case, it guessed proper. So the outside interface uses a bridge domain. It happens to be a layer 2 bridge domain. There is a DHCP server and an external layer 3 router at the other end. Don't worry about that. It's just going to allow IP connectivity for the outside of the firewall. That's it. Don't get too hung up on that. And then on the inside, I've already created another layer 2 bridge domain. It happens to be called ASA layer 3, but it is a layer 2 bridge domain. Because if you remember, any devices in EPG Platinum will use the ASA as their default gateway, not a bridge domain. So we need to make sure we've got that created. And that will be the inside interface. And we'll say finish. Now, if we go over to vCenter, we'll notice that port groups have already been created. And if we notice in just a second here, we will see vCenter automatically put the firewall interfaces into the appropriate shadow EPGs or the EPGs that we're using to stitch this into our environment. We can see the first interface has already gone, and in just a second we'll see the second interface, there it is, will automatically be put in the proper port group for this to work. So if we go back to our ASA and we look at our settings, we will see that automatically the outside and inside firewall interfaces have been put into the appropriate EPGs to stitch this service into ACI. So that's the automated part, right? This is where ACI automation stops. So if we go over here to, let's find our inside. I have a VM here called, I'm sorry, I have a Win8 ASAL3. So let's go ahead and put that. Looks like it's already in the Platinum EPG or port group that's mapped to vCenter. So if I go ahead and open the console and I do ipconfig, I've got a firewall. I have a DHCP service running on the inside interface of the firewall, which is handing out addresses. So let's say we can ping the inside of the firewall, and in fact we can. So that's a first good step. Now let's see if we can ping something outside the firewall. And we can see that it's actually working. Now, if I were to go to the firewall monitoring tab in ASDM and actually watch the traffic go through, I would actually see those information go through. But at this point, everything is working as expected, and I have successfully integrated an unmanaged virtual ASA into my environment. So if we go back and we look at the EPGs, if we look at Platinum, we can see there's our contract that's allowing the service graph to be deployed. In fact, if you hover over the contract, you can see that there is a contract name called ASA allow. And then if we look at the other EPG called migration, we can see that the contract has also been deployed on that particular side, allowing everything to happen. And that's it. It's that simple.